Independence Day, the 4th of July, is not a celebration of freedom in general, as people tend to think. What does that even mean, anyway? Freedom. The notion of freedom in general is quite enigmatic when you stop to think about it. Rather, the 4th of July is about celebrating freedom from the King of England. In other words, freedom from the rule and freedom from the laws of a particular government and from paying taxes to support that particular government. The Declaration of Independence is about the United States becoming the United States. You know, becoming a country, a nation unto itself, because before that, the people in Central America were a collection of colonies governed by Great Britain. And also included in the collection of people living in Central America at the time were the Native Americans who were already present when the colonists arrived, and white indentured servants, white slaves, were also living in Central America, in addition to the black slaves brought over from Africa. What a hodgepodge! The African people who were brought over on slave ships were treated with terrible inhumanity. And for the most part, the terrible inhumane treatment continued throughout their lives, as well as for the generations to come. With that said, many of the first Africans brought over were enslaved as indentured servants, meaning many of those first black slaves were able to obtain their freedom from slavery eventually. Oddly enough, after obtaining their freedom, some former black slaves became owners of black slaves themselves, which seems crazy. But we have to remember that slavery or indentured servitude was the accepted system of labor at the time, and for a long time before that. Forms of slavery existed in Africa as well as America before the colonists arrived in America. Slavery was nothing new, and African tribes had difficulty getting along with each other, just as Native American tribes had difficulty getting along with each other, which entailed a lot of violence and abduction of people and slavery. To be clear, Native Americans practiced a form of slavery, as did the Africans. This was the point of reference at the time. It was the culture they were born into. What a world! Compassion, compassion, compassion. At the time of the American Revolution, laws were already in place to prevent slaves from obtaining their freedom. The enslavement of persons of African origins spanned a long period of time in Central America, just as it did in South America as well as other places, islands, etc. So this system of labor looks different depending upon the time period and place you are looking at. Of course, all of it is awful. Because slavery does not look any particular way, it is best to think in terms of a variation on a theme of slavery, and to think of it as a system of labor. Any system of labor can be abusive. When you broaden your perspective in this way, it is easy not to fall into the trap of reducing slavery down to issues of racial prejudice, because slavery is really much, much more complex than that. Now, back to the 4th of July. It is important to note that most colonists, by far, did not participate in the revolt against Great Britain. Instead, they stayed on the sidelines and waited for the outcome. I believe most of the colonists just wanted to be left alone and not have to bother with the government at all. People tend to just want to get on with their lives. But we are born into whatever situation we are born into, and we go from there, which entails a lot of conscious decision-making regarding how we want to live our lives, especially if we want to make things better. And certainly, there was, and still is, a lot of experimentation regarding how to live life. U.S. citizens are taught early on to believe that they live in a melting pot of people from all over. The truth is, the early colonists struggled with the diversity they found in their communities. There was no melting going on. It was not easy for them to figure out how to get along with each other. Actually, it is still not easy for people to figure out how to get along with each other. And it is good to remember that the colonists were people who did not fit into the cultures they came from and had strong, some would say rigid, beliefs regarding how life should be lived. So our ancestors are a ragtag group of misfits and criminals and castaways with superstitious and barbaric tendencies. This includes the Native Americans and African Americans. Not too long ago, I watched a short program about the expedition of Lewis and Clark. They were sent to explore territories beyond the original colonies, territories that, for the most part, white people had not gone. President Jefferson sent them because all of that land was already thought of as belonging to the United States of America. So Jefferson was all about beginning the work to move new settlers to these lands. Mostly the land was wild and uninhabited, but there were patches of Native American tribes living there too. Tribes that, for the most part, did not get along with each other. The land itself, the terrain, kept the Native Americans divided and warring. People tend to want to imagine the early Native Americans as people living in idyllic communion with nature, when in actuality their lives were very hard and violent and filled with lots of superstitious beliefs. Lewis and Clark really owe the success of their expedition to a 16-year-old Native American girl, Sacagawea, or Bird Woman. Sacagawea being the common pronunciation of her name. She had been abducted by a tribe warring with her own, and had been rescued from her abduction by a French guy. Remember, part of Central America was originally considered to be owned by France. Sacagawea was pregnant when she set off with Lewis and Clark, a teenage pregnancy. During the expedition, she gave birth and then carried her newborn infant along after that, which is remarkable. After all, this was no easy road, or road at all. Imagine that, or try. Personally, I have no point of reference for the travails of Sacagawea's existence. But she persevered out in the wild, traveling wild terrain among dangerous wild animals. She was still a child, but she was also a new mother. And she quite successfully performed her duties as translator, guide, and diplomat, really keeping all those guys alive, including Clark's black slave, who was later freed. Amazing. Surely without Sacagawea, Lewis and Clark and all the members of the group would have been killed by Native Americans. I assume when Sacagawea looked at Lewis and Clark, she saw individuals she could trust, and she helped others trust them too. And that's the way it goes. If we truly trust, we do it on an individual-to-individual basis. When we think in terms of groups, we just end up creating us and them scenarios. A melting pot is impossible, but it is possible to move beyond merely tolerating diversity to honoring it and celebrating it. When we meet anyone, we are meeting an individual. Even a huge crowd of people is made up of individuals. And when you are really able to take this in, it is actually very exciting. All that rich and glorious diversity, all that hodgepodge. Hallelujah. But problems persist, don't they? And people tend to believe that complaining about a problem leads to a solution to that problem. People are funny. People also tend to believe that fighting solves problems. You know, that war solves problems. How long do people have to complain and fight until they finally realize that complaining and fighting do not solve problems? So when you see someone, see someone. See a person, a human being, an individual who needs to be cared about, just as you need to be cared about. And if people are wearing uniforms, still see human beings and relate to them like that, as human beings. And if their skin color or gender is different from your own, still see them as human beings and relate to them as human beings, you know, as individuals who need to be cared about. If they have different ways of going about life, ways that seem strange or unfamiliar to you, still see them as human beings. And if they refuse to see you as a human being, still see them as human beings. Be relentless in this. This is the solution. The American abolitionists in the 1800s led a loud and relentless campaign against slavery in the United States. They called their movement the anti-slavery movement. They firmly believed that people would repent once they were told that slavery was a bad thing, which is not completely outrageous because some people are capable of seeing the error of their ways. After all, some of those abolitionists came from slave-holding families, and they had repented, although they were not able to convince their family members to do so, no matter how much they hammered away at them. Much to the surprise of those abolitionists, the anti-slavery movement resulted in an immediate increase in division and violence within the population, which led to the Civil War. The American Civil War was an incredibly bloody and devastating war in which family members often found themselves fighting against each other. It is an example of an extreme failure to get along, and it demonstrates the farce that is the United States. President Lincoln's goal was to keep the Union together, but in actuality, the nation was very divided over the issue of slavery, not a true union at all. Slavery was an institution that was tied to the people's basic survival for lots of generations, and it was tied to the power of the nation, the government, since crops worked by slaves provided the major funding for the government. And the government supported slavery to the extent of creating laws against freedom for slaves, all the way to the point of making every citizen responsible for the return of runaway slaves, which is much more aggressive and controlling than making it against the law to harbor slaves. The federal government even went as far as to use the nation's military to escort an escaped slave back to his owner. So that was big news at the time, which led people to wonder just how much the government was for the people. A leading abolitionist in the anti-slavery movement actively advocated not participating in upholding the government. In other words, he urged people not to vote. The foundation of slavery was an economic one. After all, slavery is a system of labor. Racism rose up from that economic need in order to justify the atrocity of slavery, particularly the atrocious way it was being practiced at the time. But of course, in many ways, the black people living in the southern states at the time were less capable than many of the white people living there. They had been kept that way for generations through poor nutrition and poor housing and no education. Booker T. Washington, a former slave who became a famous educator, said in his autobiography, Up from Slavery, that the newly freed slaves were like a population of 10-year-old children trying to figure out what to do next. Personally, I think the same could also be said for many within the white population of the South. Such was the codependent relationship between the two races. Codependence being really just the result of a poor relationship to the interdependent nature of life itself. I'm reminded of a famous eugenics trial that happened in the South much later on, when eugenics was all the rage. Those scientists can get us into so much trouble. Anyway, the idea was to sterilize a particular white girl child because her white mother was an imbecile. This term was not meant as an insult. It was used as a scientific term to describe the mother's mental capacity. Years later, years after the little girl had been sterilized, it was discovered that the problem was not in the genes at all. It was lack of proper nutrition. Brains need to be fed. The girl had better nutrition than her mother had had, so she did just fine in school. Anyway, what was I talking about? But all these people issues really do connect. It is good to learn to hold all this stuff in your head at once, rather than to try and separate it out into issues regarding various or particular races. All these race issues are really just people issues. People will be people. So now I think of the exodus of the Jews. Indeed, many, if not all, black people at the time of the emancipation thought a lot about the story of Moses. The book of Exodus is filled with constant complaints coming from the freed Jewish people, specifically complaining about how they had it better when they were back in Egypt living as slaves. Just because a change is made for the better does not mean people know what to do with that change. They have to figure out a whole new way of living, which is not easy. But then we are always trying to figure out new and better ways of living. The phoenix is always dying and rising from the ashes. And now we have the emerging anti-racism movement. I cannot help but be reminded of the anti-slavery movement and its bloody outcome. If only people could allow history to be a cautionary tale and stop repeating the terrible mistakes that lead to the terrible outcomes. If only. People do not become better people when other people tell them they are bad. It just does not work that way. Calling people racist is simply not helpful. Seeing every person as a human being, that's helpful. I'm reminded of Booker T. Washington again. I early learned, he wrote, that it is a hard matter to convert an individual by abusing him, and that this is more often accomplished by giving credit for all the praiseworthy actions performed than by calling attention alone to all the evil done.